Hey there, welcome back to the Thatcher Report. Thanks for tuning back in. It's been a minute. I've been writing Substacks at zacharythatcher.substack.com, and I'm a little behind the podcasting. So this is going to be related to my latest post of May 13th about Mike Goldfarb, who's running for Congress in Brooklyn, and the status of the Democratic Party. My favorite topic. People often ask why I only talk about Democrats, and the answer is always the same. Look where I've lived. Massachusetts, California, and New York City are the three places I've spent 99% of my life, outside of Jerusalem for a year and maybe 6 months in Washington, D.C. In America, I've only lived in majority Democratic cities and states that have only become more Democratic generally, maybe except for New York, but it's a little bit more diverse, but not by much. In any event, this makes me an expert in Democratic politics and not in Republican politics, because I just have not spent that much time in a place with lots of Republicans. Um, so, in any event, that's my focus. And of course, in America, we have a two-party system. And no matter how good the arguments are for more parties, it's not likely going to happen in my lifetime. And just for the record, more parties sounds great when you're coming from a two-party system, but it can create some real distortions, like in Israel, where you have minority parties, specifically for ultra-religious Jews called Haredim, who wield a ton of power because they're like a little chit to make a coalition. And then so like a very, very small group can dictate policy for the entire country. It's not very democratic. There's arguments for and against, but in any event, we live in America, and it's a thriving country, 250 years old as a democracy. And I think we have a lot of problems and challenges in this country, but it's a lot better than the alternative, which is non Western countries, primarily China, North Korea, Iran, so forth. These are not great places to live if you're just an average person born randomly in the country, not a good life. So, in any event, this is the country we have. We have problems. We have lots and lots and lots of attributes, namely our Constitution and our work ethic and our traditions of democracy. Speaking of democracy, the other week, I invited, now you know me, I always say everybody's a young man or a young woman. I invited a young man, he's 30, at the tender age of 39, so he's not that young. He's been around the block, he's married, he has a child, and he owns a house, and he's adulting pretty hard. His name is Mike Goldfarb. And as you can guess, he's a Jewish guy from the area. His grandparents lived in Crown Heights. He grew up in Long Island. I would say it seems like from sort of a middle class, petit bourgeois background. His family had a toy store. And he himself got himself into Harvard and did a lot with that degree. He made a lot of money in his, I'm guessing, his late 20s and 30s in the private sector, and now apparently is quite wealthy and has the free time and the ability to run for office, which is just an incredibly hard job. So he's running for the Democratic congressional seat in New York District 9, which is kind of like central Brooklyn. Brooklyn is huge. It's the size of Chicago. It has lots of different congressional districts, and this is one of them, which is mine. And it's been represented by an incumbent, Yvette Clarke, for 19 years. And Yvette Clarke is not very well known nationally. She's sort of, and his argument is that's a problem. She's sort of a do nothing congresswoman, according to Goldfarb. She just hasn't put many points on the board. She's in her early 60s. She's Black. She's a member of the Black Congressional Caucus, and she describes herself as a senior member of the Progressive Congressional Caucus, which has obviously emerged as a more and more powerful caucus in the Democratic Party over the years. So she's playing in those regions. And Mike educated us that her mother, I think her name is Una, who's now quite old and lives in Jamaica, was a New York local political figure who kind of helped her daughter, Yvette, rise to great prominence and have a congressional seat. But really, it was the mom who was the kind of brains behind the operation and did more. Yvette Clarke, according to Goldfarb, hasn't really done much for the district. So Mike came over. We had some pizza. It was just kind of a smaller crowd. I was hoping for a larger group, but there just wasn't a lot of interest. I don't know. It's a congressional primary election. It's super inside baseball. So I think you understand how it works. But this is their primary in the Democratic Party to decide who they're going to advance to the general election in November. But as we all know, whoever wins the primary, like in a very deep red state, they're going to win the general election. This is a super blue district. I think it's changing, but not by enough. Changing for the Republicans, but not by enough to make a difference at all. It's what are we in here? It's 2026, so we're in an off year. In June, you have to vote. So not that many people are going to turn out. I didn't get even that many people at my event, although the people were there were really engaged. So it's just really cool that we get to live in a country where a politician or a potential politician will come to your house and just talk to you and talk to your friends and just be transparent about his intentions for power and make an argument of why you should support him versus his competitor. It's really, really unusual in the world to have this kind of democratic moment. It's just really special. If you have not been to third world countries or non-Western countries, you kind of take it for granted, perhaps. I certainly did until I started traveling to places like Vietnam, Jordan, Egypt. I'm trying to think of other places I went. They're not free. You don't have elections. The politicians do not need to talk to you at all, other than to seek praise, and which they are guaranteed, or they'll kill you, or you will fall out of favor. So it was really cool. Mike, he's kind of presents, as they say, he's younger, smarter, harder working, very successful, and he's than the competition. And what was interesting to me and what we're going to talk about here is that he's pitching himself as independent of the wider Democratic Party status quo. And we'll talk about why he says, I'm not part of the establishment, which is true. He's not in the establishment yet, and why he's particularly saying, look, I'm independent. I'm going to be like a John Fetterman or a Richie Torres or somebody. Fetterman's obviously in the Senate. Torres is in the Congress, from the Westchester Bronx area. But he's not saying, I'm going to fix the party, or I'm sort of, like the Gavin Newsom kind of like flag bearer of the party, or an AOC who I think has taken over the party. And she certainly is part of the new vanguard. I don't know if it's fair to call her the establishment. The term establishment changes all the time, but she's sort of representative of a much wider movement than just her congressional district. That's not what Goldfarb says. He's like, look, I'm going to be kind of independent. So the reality is that it's an uphill climb for him. His argument is that Yvette Clarke hasn't delivered. And I've only lived in the district 5 or so years, I think almost exactly. And it seems like there are not really any federal dollars here that I can see. We don't have any new libraries or new infrastructure or even new playgrounds or any, which is, a lot of that's going to be city and state dollars, but maybe like a bigger thing, like a federal subsidy to build like elevators and escalators in the subways, which are super inaccessible if you have a stroller, like in my case for Felix, or if you are an elderly person or otherwise disabled. It's completely, there's just you can't just point to anything new in the district and be like, wow, Yvette Clarke delivered these federal dollars and now we have this amazing new library or something. We just, or new park or whatever it could be, some highway or something, or I prefer mass transit, but there's just nothing. And that's kind of his argument. But why it's an uphill climb is obviously she's an incumbent, and in the brass knuckles reality of ethnic politics, which is always and forever, a condition of for humans is she's Black. And we're in a district that used to be more Black. It still is lots and lots and lots of Black people live here, but more and more of them have been leaving the city. These are kind of lower middle class homeowner types and others, because it's just so expensive. And taxes only go up and the city services only go down, right? We have the highest per capita spending per student in the public system in the country, and we have some of the worst outcomes for public students in the country. So if you're a middle class person, maybe you're lucky you inherited a house from your parents or something like that, or grandparents, and you're trying to survive as a middle class person in this city, it's almost impossible if your income is from like a city job or something like that, or whatever, however you define being middle class. They're not expanding. And so that really impacts the Black community in New York City. And so they're leaving, right? Because they're going to red states, which we're told are racist and full of white supremacists and all these horrible, horrible things about Republicans. But more Black people are moving to them because they're cheaper. And obviously, there's Black people in the South historically, so it's not like they're moving to Alaska. These are places with community support and so on. So what that means in the electorate in New York and in my district is that it's becoming more white and more Muslim, because we have a lot more inflow of Muslim immigrants from Central Asia and the Middle East. There's always an inflow of immigrants from some new place in New York. It's kind of amazing to see. I myself am a grandson of Jewish immigrants from Ukraine who moved to New York, to the Bronx, and created a life here. And now one of the new, and then, obviously there are Puerto Ricans, Italians, Irish, all the different groups that go to this country, Latinos. And now one of the major groups is Muslims, and they're voting, and they're very politically engaged, and they're getting a lot of traction in the Democratic Party, which is the only party that matters for most of New York City. So it's kind of an uphill battle for a white Jewish guy to go against that, even though he makes some really great arguments. So unfortunately, these kind of racial politics, it's the norm in this country, right? And I think that the right wing doesn't talk about it as much anymore. I think that they have progressed, to use a loaded term, from the 1950s or whenever these were really hot issues, 1960s, even the 1970s. It's 2026. Time has gone on. The culture shifts and changes. The right wing was very race based in the mid 20th century, and they lost basically the argument with as manifest by legislation that is passed in Congress, reflecting the will of the people, and of course by Supreme Court rulings. But it wasn't all by the Supreme Court. Brown versus Board of Education was important, but maybe much more important was the Voting Rights Act and Civil Rights Act and all of these different, and Housing Rights Acts in the 60s and into the early 70s. That was the will of the American people. We did not want to have segregation anymore. We wanted to acknowledge Jim Crow in the South. It did not really go acknowledged in the North, the more passive forms of it. But I can't even say passive, because redlining and segregation in the North was on the books to a degree. But in any event, the right lost that argument. The left won it with the civil rights movement, and this country went through some major, major changes. And some people to this day say, no, it didn't. It's Jim Crow 2.0. We've never progressed. But I just think that's factually not true. I think that's a lie that some people on the left say in order to claim power over you. I just don't think it's factually true. I don't think we have segregation the way we used to. I don't think we have Jim Crow the way we used to. There's lots and lots of evidence of this. Just look at all the Black politicians who get elected. Speaking of Yvette Clarke in my neighborhood, or people in the South, like the senator from Georgia and so on. So in any event, I think the racial politics in this country are kind of eternal. It's part of our DNA. They've shifted from the domain of the right to now the domain of the left. And the left says, no, I'm wrong. DEI is not about racial preferences. Identity politics is kind of a slur from the right. That's not at all what it's about. And I just also don't think that's true. I think genetics is just kind of built into the American mindset. And it seems that it's toggled over time from the right wing to the left wing. And they both, and there are a lot of great ways to tell this, because they use science ethics, political theories. They use all types of evidence or proofs to show that their version of genetic superiority is best, right? There was all this horrible eugenics and race science in the 1920s and phrenology, measuring people's skulls and looking at their faces and all types of nonsense that it wasn't even right wing or left wing. It was just kind of the vanguard of science in the 20th century, which was in America and in Nazi Germany, and I'm sure in England and lots of other places to justify segregation and all types of racist policies. Well, that's just shifted to the left. Now they have, it's not really called this anymore, but there's critical race theory. There's all these ideas of invented terminology like settler colonialism, which is different from, I don't know, like the pilgrim colonialism or something. And they have all these different political theories. They have the left is the left. They have ethics to support their claims of resistance and indigeneity. These are just all the terms that we would have heard 100 years ago in 1926, but from and basically the same exact policies. We have to exclude some groups based on their genetics, and we have to raise and prioritize other groups based on their genetics. Nobody on the left agrees with me that this is happening in the left, but I just think if you open your eyes and you look at people who were, this is a couple years ago, but they would wear t-shirts like "the future is female." There's stuff about more t-shirts, protect trans kids, stuff like that. These are just, DEI, the entire DEI framework is not kind of like a secondary aspect to left-wing or democratic politics or left-wing culture. It's central to their belief of justice. This is what animates them for holding or trying to hold power, is that they have a superior ethical outlook, which is racially based, and you should vote for them. And if you don't vote for them, you're unethical and immoral, right? You're in a cult. Now it's for Donald Trump or whatever. But these are the trends in American politics that we maybe didn't see as clearly into the 21st century, heading to our 250th anniversary. But I think that they're clear now, that racial thinking can't really go away, unfortunately, in this country. It's just shifted polarity in politics. And remember, a lot of the race science of the 1920s and so forth, from my understanding, wasn't super politicized. People were like, "No, that's just what the scientists say. Negroes are inferior, Jews are inferior, and Anglos are superior," or something. And obviously, in hindsight, that's just really stupid and wrong. But we're still living within this framework in America. I don't know really what it's like in Europe. I think they have more of like an old fashioned ethnic supremacy where, like, if you're French, you're just superior and everybody else is an interloper. Certainly, it seems like Asian countries like Japan have that viewpoint. In any event, sticking closer to the home, this guy came over. He's very smart. He's super down to earth. He doesn't seem like he came from a fancy family and uses $5 words like I am guilty of doing all the time. And he didn't have like airs about him, and he didn't have snobbery or a lot of the things that I don't love about myself. You didn't have. He was just really down to earth, just seems like kind of like a regular guy, meaning much more middle class, from Long Island, grew up coming to Brooklyn to visit grandparents in this district. And, you know, he has a fresh perspective, I'm going to argue, on the Democratic Party, which I think I share with him, because he is disfavored ethnically. He has the wrong genetics for the party. Who has the right genetics for the party? Well, look at who they nominated, Kamala Harris, and look at some of the stars of the party. Now, obviously, Gavin Newsom, there's lots of white male counterexamples to what I'm about to say, but the stars of the party, Kamala Harris is still a major political figure. And then, of course, I always talk about AOC, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar. These are the correct genetics, right? Female, of color, which I think is a nonsense term, but it's what we're stuck with in this country, and so on. So he's white, Jewish, he's male, he's straight, he's reproduced with a female to make a child. He's that's not the favored ethnicity for the Democratic Party, and they have all their various race theories about the Western canon and DEI and the civil rights movement and everything to back up their claims of his inferiority. That's one part of him. And he's also a very successful businessman who did not come from money and acquired a lot of money through his own luck and hard work and abilities and being in the right place at the right time and and I'm sure lots of crazy, harrowing decisions, but it worked for him. And he was in the finance world, and then he created a business, a payment transferring business, and that worked great. He made a lot of money, and this gives him a very this gives him a fresh perspective on the party. Right, the party right now is focused on genetics and socialism are the two emerging dominant narratives within the party. And I know people are like, wow, Zachary, it's really not fair to think of it that way, but I don't know how else to understand Zohran Mamdani other than his ethnic ethnic favoritism, if you could say, because he's perceived to be darker skinned and Muslim and therefore underrepresented, marginalized, even though he comes from a very wealthy and powerful family. That doesn't matter to the Democrats. He's marginalized because of his skin color and because he is not Christian or Jewish. Now, obviously, Jews are a much tinier minority than Muslims, but that doesn't matter in the genetic race science of today. And of course, he's a socialist. He's very famously a democratic socialist. I don't think he's an outlier anymore. Maybe people could have made that argument a couple years ago, but based on other politicians, other democratic politicians running for Congress in the Senate and the House this year, it seems like democratic socialism is getting more popular among the base, not less popular. It's a debate, obviously, but the socialism that he represents is kind of easy to say, oh, that's kind of extreme, free buses, grocery stores, raising taxes, that's crazy. But that's kind of the norm for democratic economic policy for, like, in my lifetime, which is to expand government and raise taxes. This is a big debate in the 80s with Reaganomics. People debated it back and forth. Obviously, it's a big debate in this country, but the Democrats don't represent smaller government and fewer costs and fewer regulations. It's just not the makeup of the party. So, in any event, Mike Goldfarb, being white and Jewish, and then being a successful businessman, gives him a different perspective. And he is saying that means that I'm independent and you should vote for me because I'm going to deliver for the district. And I'm also not going to be swayed by these kind of faddish issues and serving red meat to the base that somebody like AOC or Omar or so forth does, like with anti-Zionism and all this kind of stuff. And killing billionaires, ending billionaires, destroying billionaires, taxing whatever it is, they always have a boogeyman and some kind of enemy that you have to physically attack, like in the United Healthcare mass killing of the CEO and all the stuff that Hassan Piker and the New York Times apparently supports, actual violent physical attack on people. Which you're seeing more and more. It's all coming from the left. Not all of it, but it's like 90% coming from the left these days. He is offering an independent perspective from that trend within the party. So here's where I disagree with Mike. And I have to say, he's a really good guy. I encourage people in the NY9 district to vote for him in the primary, which is June 23rd. And there's early voting, I think like a week beforehand. It's a little confusing in New York. And obviously, we have closed primaries. Thank you, Democratic Party, for ensuring that we don't really have a Democratic inclusion in our elections. They're exclusive of anybody who's not a Democrat, and Democrats are the ones who make 99% of the seats in the 5 boroughs, seats in Congress, seats in the city council, so forth. So I'm going to criticize him, but I'm doing it from a place of love and support because I think he's smart. And if he was on this podcast, maybe he would agree with some of my things or have a really good counter that I would agree with. But I think that the Democratic Party is beyond redemption and should be abolished. It's rare to have a party go away, but it happened with the Whigs maybe only once, or there's different moments, very rare moments in American history. I'm not enough of a scholar of 19th century American politics to talk about it with any insight, but I just think the party is just so entrenched in the civil rights movement from the 1960s and in, I guess you could call it quasi socialism to actual socialism, that I don't think that either one of those perspectives on genetics or economics are working. And I think there needs to be a new focus, and the party should literally just go away, and we should have a new name. We should have new think tanks, not the progressive, the groups, they call them, all these various interest groups and new ones like all the trans stuff. Those are all represented by interest groups, climate change, stuff like that, these different groups. I don't think that they are useful to the country or to the party. And obviously new funding sources. Maybe I know George Soros is a boogeyman of the right, and a lot of that has a heavy dose of anti-Semitism. But some of George Soros's groups have funded pretty extreme pro-Palestinian, anti-Western activists in this country, and I just don't agree with their perspective. And I would like to see funding sources fund something else that actually is positive, in my opinion. That stuff is negative for this country. I think the Democratic Party should reconstitute itself on three principles or three pillars. They're really simple: prosperity, infrastructure, and security. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time politicking here about how I think there should be a new political party or a revised version of it. Some people talk about abundance, but they don't get away from the genetics in the abundance talk. But some of their points are really good. I don't. Maybe they're happening on the margins in some parts of the Democratic establishment, but in any event, people want money. People want modern infrastructure, which also helps you make money, because if you can get to work faster or you can travel across the country faster, you can create more jobs and more opportunities for wealth, or more data centers or whatever. And then, of course, physical security. That always comes first. You got to be safe, right? I'm living in a time of increased violence against Jewish people. It's nothing that we've seen in recent American history. It's more of a return, speaking of the 20th century racism, it's more of a return to that period where it's just kind of politically it's acceptable, it's almost politically worthy to protest to the point of exclusion and violence is what's happening. And I'm not a fan of not having security. I think everybody on Earth, certainly, let's say in America, everybody wants to be physically secure. We have more and more violence in the subway system, and a lot of that's related to the genetic favoritism of the Democratic Party, because Black people disproportionately commit violent crimes. Men do too, of course, and of a certain age range. And but because of our judicial reforms, people are not locked up, or they're not forced into confined psychiatric facilities until they're not a danger to humanity. There's just a turnstile with the jails and with the hospitals, and so we have a lot of recidivism. Let's put it that way, and that means you don't have security. And so I think we should have security. So I think you abolish the whole darn thing. Mike Goldfarb seems to say, this is an imaginary debate because I just listened respectfully to him. He was like, I don't think that's right, Zachary. I think people like me and others can nudge the party in the right direction. The Democrats used to be for segregation until they became the party of the civil rights movement. This is the 1940s to the 1970s, let's say, their 30-year period, maybe a 20-year period of massive change for the Democratic Party. We can just kind of continue to evolve. That it's a good argument. And but a tell for me is that he trotted out an argument that you might not have heard before. Well, you've probably heard it, but maybe you haven't focused on it. It's something Jewish people mostly talk about. So I know I have some listeners who are not Jewish, who are Jewish, but this is the argument. He says, I'm paraphrasing, not an actual quote, but he basically says, look, Democrats are really hypocritical, or left-wing, or progressives, whatever word you want to say for active political people of the left and active writers on the left in the newsrooms. He's like, they're really hypocritical because they say, look, gay rights are so important. LGBTQ rights are like one of the central tenets of the Democratic Party. You could certainly say that it's not a central tenet of the Republican Party, because I don't think they care as much anymore about certainly the L and the G. And they're just like, okay, whatever, you're just a person, you're an American. As long as you're an American, you're good. And that's why there's so many gay people in the Trump administration, which always goes sort of unnoted by the Democrats, or they come up with some excuses to explain it away. But in any event, the Democrats certainly care about LGBTQ rights, and they add all these letters, and it becomes kind of a satire. But it's something really important to them. Well, and also what's really important to them is punishing Israel for perceived human rights violations. Well, the wrinkle, of course, is that the only country in the Middle East with gay rights is Israel, right? Israel is like being in Europe or America. They don't even have gay neighborhoods in Tel Aviv. Gay people just live wherever they want to live. And it's even more advanced than parts of America. And they have gay Knesset members and so on and so forth, military. It's just a very progressive, liberated way of not really thinking too much about people's sexuality. And this is obviously a country, Israel, that's also Jewish. It's a Jewish democracy. So there's lots of stuff in Orthodox and ultra Orthodoxy, which is totally homophobic, as they would say, totally against gay life. And it doesn't matter. There's a secular government. They're like, okay, you guys, religious guys, can say whatever you want. You can do whatever you want in your synagogue, I guess, but like gay people are fine. So, but not so in any Arab country or any Muslim country. And it's just hypocritical that Democrats are saying LGBTQ rights are like one of the most important civil rights issues for the Democratic Party, but not when it comes to Israel. They flip, and they're kind of pro-Islam, which is horrific to gay people. Literally, just murders gay people all over the Middle East, and lots of examples of violence against gay people in Arab countries. So it's a hypocrisy. And if only the Democrats would recognize their hypocrisy, then they would change, and then they would realize Israel's not a boogeyman. That's kind of the thinking. And you can do this for environmentalism, minority rights. Christians do better in Israel than they do anywhere else in the Arab Muslim world. Liberal cultural values, free speech, all the things that are just kind of like normal about life in America and normal about life in, let's say, like England or France or even Germany nowadays after World War II. That's what it's like in Israel. It's kind of like being in Europe. It's kind of like being in Southern California. It's like a mashup, kind of like Miami. And, only if the Democrats would just think about it a little bit more, they would realize, oh, right, Israel's fine, actually, or Israel may have perceived human rights violations. Name me a country that doesn't. Is it just a coincidence that there's mass poverty of Muslim Arab immigrants in segregated communities, the banlieues, or however you pronounce it in France? Like, there's racism and civil rights violations everywhere. That doesn't excuse them anywhere, but it's kind of part of life where you have fighting. And obviously there's a lot of fighting in Israel, but there's lots of problems everywhere. It's not disqualifying for nationhood. It's kind of a factor of all nations. Certainly we have lots of problems in this country too. And in our prison system, for example, we have the death penalty, which seems awfully kind of racist. If only the Democrats would just think about it, then they would just change. So this is thinking that you hear mostly from Jewish, more establishment kind of thinkers, which I'm going to call last gen liberals, like last generation or obsolete liberals. And as you can tell from my term, I think that they're a disappearing group. I just don't think this is a persuasive argument for anybody else in the Democratic Party. And you can tell some of these people, they'll talk about sometimes, oh, I believe in a two-state solution, right? This is all super inside baseball about Israel. But I think, as you know, my argument over the past couple of years, that Israel and Judaism is like a fulcrum for some of the issues in the Democratic Party. It's a really important fulcrum. It's really easy to isolate and look at, but it's a stand-in for lots of other issues about genetics and perceptions of social justice, that animates the party. So I think if you look at Israel, or how Israel is treated and perceived by liberals, you're going to understand a lot of other issues, like about how they think about trans, or how they think about Black people, or people of color, or these different terms that come and go, BIPOC, LGBTQ, and who should be included and who should be excluded. So in any event, they talk about the two-state solution. I'm not going to go too deep into why that's so ridiculous, but let's just say the two states, there's only one thing Israelis and Palestinians agree on. which is they don't want the two-state solution. The only people who want a two-state solution, by and large, is a smaller and smaller and smaller group of American liberals of a certain age or of a certain mentality. That's the only constituency that I can identify that talks anymore about a two-state solution, like from the Oslo Accords, which were from the mid-90s. And newsflash, they didn't work, right? It's now 30 years later, they didn't work. There's a war. There's just warfare. Israel now occupies 60% of Gaza after the horrific invasion on October 7th. The West Bank is kind of this quasi semi-sovereignty with a very ineffectual and corrupt and racist and problematic Palestinian Authority and settler violence. It's not a happy situation for people on the ground. And there's a giant security fence and barrier, wall, it's fence, it's a different in different places, but there's a giant barrier in the West Bank keeping Palestinians from infiltrating to Israel and killing people. That's what was happening during the Second Intifada. Ariel Sharon came up with a solution, which is put up a wall, put up a security barrier. And guess what? It worked. The left in Israel wasn't happy about it, but now it's like normal part of life because your kids aren't getting killed by Palestinians coming in. So the two-state solution is completely dead on arrival. It just doesn't make any sense. But the people talking about it are these sort of vanishing group of liberals. And that's instructive, right? Because it's a fantasy, but they're holding on to the fantasy to try to make this argument that, hey, guys, hey, other Democrats, other progressives, all you new kids who are, democratic socialists or on the trans vanguard or whatever, all these new innovations within the party. I'm one of you because I believe in a two-state solution. I happen to be Jewish, maybe, or happen to be a liberal with Jewish people in my constituency, and like a Gavin Newsom or something. And I'm a good guy, right? I'm with you guys because I believe that there's actually an equal claim to sovereignty in the Israel-Palestine region. And you just simply divide it up. It's a great solution. Everybody's happy. And therefore, I'm a good guy. I'm not biased. Well, unfortunately, empirically, that let's just have a fair division hasn't worked, right? There's a long history of it not working, but currently, right now, today, it's not working. And there's an uncomfortable truth, which essentially zero liberals will discuss, either last gen obsolete liberals who are kind of clinging to these kind of pretty words, or Zohran Mamdani, kind of the more cutting edge vanguard. And the uncomfortable truth is that political Islam is genocidal by definition. They're very open about this. You don't only have to look at the Hamas charter for this. You can just look at any Muslim country and say, what are the rights like for non-Arab Muslims, right? They are not allowed to have rights. And if you agree that political Islam is genocidal, like literally they want to kill or at least segregate in ghettos, and then ideally kill. There's no kill, meaning you can't have any alternative sovereignty in the Middle East unless you're Arab and Muslim, or you're Persian and Muslim in Iran. That's it. If Jews obviously have a counterexample, and they've been attacked since well before 1948, and they're being attacked today. There are missiles. There's going to be missile fire or drone attacks today from Shias in Lebanon, which has nothing to do with Palestinians. So if you and they're shooting drones into civilian places, it's indiscriminate. The attacks from Muslims on Israel are indiscriminate. They don't target military bases. They just target anybody Jewish. Yahud is how you say it in Arabic, which is Yahudim, which means Judeans, people from the region of Judea. And the reality is that that's a genocidal intent. It has been since maybe the 1920s. And for Israel to survive, they need military dominance. And you can also just say, okay, forget about Jews. Just look at the Kurds, right? They're Muslim, majority Sunni, but they're not Arab and they're not Persian, and they have an army too. And they've carved out little bits of mini sovereignty in northern Iraq, but they have, there are lots of Kurds and lots of other regions, other countries around there, and they too are fighting a genocide against them. And that's just the reality of Arab Islamic politics. And to survive that, you need to be very strong militarily. So that's really what's happening in the Middle East. And it's an uncomfortable truth that last gen liberals won't tackle, and current gen liberals and progressives are just pretend isn't happening. And they use a race argument of colonialism, white supremacy. They use these race arguments to explain it that are from maybe the 1950s in the Deep South in America. They're kind of a transplant a framework that has absolutely nothing to do with Arab Muslim politics, which is like 400 million people in North Africa and the Middle East. But so when I hear people like Goldfarb or other politicians talk about a two-state solution or talk about, hey, gays have great lives in Israel. Gay Palestinians go from the West Bank to Tel Aviv to have a better life. And if they become a citizen of Israel, then they can vote, and they're just, sure, there's racism like any other country, there's problems like in any other country, but they become a citizen of a modern liberal democracy, and they get to live. And you don't get to live if you stay outed in Ramallah, which is really close to Tel Aviv. That's just the difference. So I reject this entire framework of thinking. Obviously, I reject the current vanguard of politics and this last gen liberalism. It doesn't work. It's not intellectually consistent, or I'm not saying Mike Goldfarb is dishonest. I think he's a super honest person and he has my vote. But I think the thinking isn't really honest because it doesn't really grasp and wrestle with some very hard truths. And another tell of the obsolescence of the older establishment liberals is an appeal to centrism. They say, oh, look, these kids protesting at college campuses, which they are continuing to do at Cornell, not that long ago, just like a couple of days ago. And at NYU, raising a flag with the Jewish star and with Nazi swastikas at NYU during the commencement. Those are all these crazy kids, and Zohar Mamdani and the Michigan Senate Al Sayed. I don't remember his name. If it's a couple of different names, but the likely contender, Graham Plattner, running for Senate in Maine. All of this stuff. These are just these smelly college kids. Rashida Tlaib, Ilham Omar. I'm going to keep interrupting because I just think there's more and more and more of them, and they're more and more powerful. But no, that's all a sideshow. That's just these smelly college kids. Really, we're centrist, and we believe in centrism, and that's a better way forward. That's more appealing to America. Okay, that's a nice argument. I also don't like these extreme student activists, and they're all the politicians and the publications and the statements at the Academy Awards and almost every museum director in America who's focused on genetics instead of aesthetics. Okay, so what is centrism? What do you believe in? What's your policy? What's a centrist policy? And they don't have a centrist policy. There's no answer to any of that from these last gen liberals or these establishment liberals. This could be like Kathy Hochul in New York. It's embarrassing to say I don't even know who the governor is right now in Massachusetts. It's a woman. I forget her name. But let's say she's a centrist too. What do they believe in? Do they want more regulation or less regulation? Do they want more taxes and fees and fines and costs, or fewer taxes, fees, fines, and costs? Can they point to infrastructure that they've developed, or can they not? And I just don't get what their argument is for advancing this country other than saying we're not extremists. And I'm going to say they are extremists. They're just on a spectrum of extremism that believes in genetics and that believes in some form of socialism. I know that's kind of a slur, and I don't mean it that way, but some form of expanding government versus shrinking government and all the costs that come with that. So I think you get where I'm going with this. I don't agree with really anything coming out of the Democratic Party. I just don't understand what their policies are if they're not how I'm bucketing them into genetic favoritism and selection and expansive government. So I've kind of departed a little bit from my essay, but that's really the focus of it. People talk about identity politics. Again, that's kind of like, it's become kind of a slur. It's sort of like, oh, it's not fair just to say all the Democrats care about identity politics. But from my perspective, as somebody as a disfavored identity, because I am a man, I'm perceived to be white in this country, I am straight, and I am Jewish. Those are four knocks against me on the racial preference, on the preference totem pole, right? I do not qualify for a DEI advantage or an LGBTQ advantage. I do not qualify for a BIPOC advantage, right? Those are all kind of protected groups. I don't get any of that advantages if I'm applying for a job or trying to go to university or something like that. So I'm going to say that identity politics is central to the Democratic Party and to left-wing politics and culture in general in this country, because because identity is about justice. It's about social justice. It's about the left-wing view of what makes the country and the world a better place to be, which is this idea of equity. We're all going to get the fresh start from the same starting point, which is not how it's ever worked once in human history. And we're going to prioritize skin color diversity and gender diversity and sexuality diversity and even anti-gender diversity at the expense of other groups. It is just the core of their manifest policy and their ethics, right? The ethics are that the civil rights movement was the greatest time in American history. I happen to agree with that. And we got to keep it going. And this is the new manifestation of the civil rights movement, which is racial equity policies, all this kind of stuff. I just don't see it that way. That's why they had Kamala Harris in her spot. I used to argue with a good friend of mine that that was kind of racist to say she's a DEI candidate. I've changed my thinking based on how the party is going and my own blinkers that we're on. So I think identity, or what I think is better to call it genetics, is truly one of the main pillars, one of the two pillars of the Democratic movement, the Democratic Party, and the other pillar being expanding government and government as an authority in our lives that should be increased, not decreased, in order to do better for this country, in order to have a growing pie, all the things that everybody wants. I don't think Democrats have bad intentions. Some do, maybe, and some Republicans do. But in general, I think a lot of them want things to be better, and these are their ways of doing it. And the Goldfarb candidacy, which I encourage people to support in my district, reminded me of some of these dynamics. And it just doesn't leave me feeling very positive about the party and the direction it's going in. I think there needs to be alternatives. We have a two-party system, so vote for the alternative until the Democrats change. That's my takeaway from this moment in American history. All right, thanks very much for listening. Have a great day.